The Alpha King feigned blindness to test his staff, until a new Omega Maid surprised him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, King Alaric Blackwood, whose palace stood like a quiet sentinel at the edge of the northern forest, its marble halls polished to a shine that reflected tradition rather than truth, because behind the banners and the orderly footsteps of servants, something unseen had begun to shift. Something the king himself had set in motion when he chose to feign blindness after a ceremonial accident the court whispered about in lowered voices, an affliction that never touched his strength yet changed how people treated him. And Alaric listened, memorized, and waited as aides softened their tones in public but sharpened them in corners, as courtiers delayed tasks assuming he would never notice, and as kindness became a performance measured by who was watching. For Alaric was not searching for sympathy, but for sight of another kind, the ability to discern loyalty without the crutch of fear, to hear honesty when flattery fell away, and so he learned the rhythms of the palace by sound alone, the echo of boots on stone, the rustle of silk, the pauses that betrayed impatience, and the sighs that revealed contempt, until one morning a new presence entered his routine, light-footed and careful, announcing herself not with words, but with consideration, placing a cup exactly where his hand expected it to be, speaking only when asked, and when she did speak, her voice carried steadiness rather than pity. And this was Elena Moore, an Omega Maid newly assigned, overlooked by most, underestimated by all, yet she navigated the halls as if every small task mattered, describing the weather beyond the tall windows without exaggeration, aligning chairs by feel rather than sight, and offering assistance without asking for credit, which unsettled the king more than any open disrespect had, because her actions did not change when no one was looking, and when he tested her with silence, she did not rush to fill it. When he feigned confusion, she did not correct him sharply, and when others attempted to shift blame toward her, she accepted responsibility calmly while continuing her work, and Alaric felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, a recognition that did not rely on vision, for the palace had grown loud with pretense, yet this Omega moved through it quietly, seeing him not as a weakened ruler or a symbol to be managed, but as a person, deserving of care without conditions. And as the day wore on and the sun traced its arc beyond walls he pretended not to see, the king understood that his test had begun to answer itself, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through the steady presence of someone who treated dignity as a habit rather than a performance. And for the first time since he had closed his eyes on purpose, King Alaric Blackwood wondered who was truly being tested. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm that only King Alaric seemed to notice, because while the palace staff continued their routines with practiced efficiency, their behavior shifted subtly now that his supposed blindness had become familiar rather than shocking, and complacency crept in where caution once lived. Voices grew louder when they assumed he could not track them, footsteps slowed. Duties were postponed with excuses that sounded reasonable only to those who were not truly listening. Yet Alaric listened to everything, counting seconds, measuring distance by echo, memorizing the emotional weight behind each word. And through it all Elena Moore remained constant, arriving each morning with the same quiet composure, greeting him by name rather than title unless protocol required otherwise, adjusting his cloak when drafts slipped through the stone corridors, and narrating small details of the day not to impress him but to orient him, such as the scent of rain carried in from the gardens or the way sunlight warmed the western wall by mid-morning. And it became clear to him that she was not performing kindness but practicing it, which was far rarer than loyalty sworn under oath. And he tested this gently at first by misplacing objects and waiting to see if frustration would flicker across her voice. Yet she simply paused, recalculated, and guided his hand again without a sigh. Then he tested her patience by changing instructions halfway through tasks, observing how she adapted without complaint, and when other servants attempted to correct her in sharp whispers, she did not defend herself loudly nor shrink inward. She accepted the correction with grace and quietly fixed what needed fixing, and this unsettled the hierarchy more than rebellion ever could. Because Elena did not challenge authority, yet somehow exposed its weaknesses, and Alaric sensed resentment building around her like pressure before a storm, especially from those who had grown comfortable cutting corners. And one afternoon he overheard a steward remark that the Omega Maid was wasting time on unnecessary details for a king who could not see them, a comment followed by low laughter, and Alaric felt the familiar chill of disappointment, not for himself, but for the palace he ruled. And later that same day, when Elena returned to escort him through the gallery, he deliberately veered off the known path, forcing her to choose between correcting him publicly or adapting privately, and she chose adaptation, adjusting her steps to keep him safe while softly describing a different route as if it had been planned all along, saving his dignity without drawing attention. And in that moment Alaric understood that leadership did not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it steadied another person when the ground shifted. And as the evening bells marked the hour, he found himself asking her questions that had nothing to do with duty, careful not to cross lines yet curious about her perspective. And she answered honestly but briefly, never oversharing, never fishing for favor. And when he asked why she worked so carefully for someone who might never notice, she replied that care was not about being seen but about doing what felt right, a statement that lingered with him long after she excused herself. And alone in his chambers he reflected that the palace had been built to display power, yet it was Elena who revealed its character. And as night settled and the halls quieted, King Alaric Blackwood realized that his test was no longer about uncovering disloyalty, but about recognizing integrity when it appeared quietly at his side. By the third week of his feigned blindness, the palace had grown careless in ways that revealed more than open defiance ever could. Schedules slipped by minutes that turned into hours, instructions were followed loosely, and decisions that once required his approval were made in his absence with an ease that suggested long-practiced impatience. And King Alaric catalogued it all, while maintaining the illusion of dependence, allowing himself to be guided through corridors he knew by heart, accepting explanations he knew were incomplete. And meanwhile Elena Moore moved through this unraveling order with the same measured steadiness, quietly correcting mistakes before they reached consequence, reminding others of duties, without accusation, and absorbing frustration that was never meant for her. Because as an Omega Maid she was the safest target, and Alaric noticed how often blame slid toward her when tensions rose, how often apologies never followed, and how rarely anyone asked if she was overwhelmed. And one afternoon the strain surfaced when a senior attendant questioned Elena sharply for rearranging a room without authorization, her voice tight with irritation. And Elena listened without interruption, hands folded, eyes lowered respectfully, then explained calmly that the change had been made to ensure the king could move safely through the space without obstacles. And the attendant dismissed the explanation with a wave, muttering that accommodations were becoming excessive. And Alaric felt something firm settle inside him, not anger, but clarity. Because the line between accommodation and inconvenience revealed exactly who valued his dignity and who merely tolerated it. And later that evening he asked Elena to read to him from a historical ledger, choosing a text dense with dates and measurements. And she read slowly, clearly, pausing when he raised a hand, adjusting her pace to match his breathing rather than the page. And when he asked her opinion on a decision recorded in the text, she hesitated before answering honestly that leadership sometimes failed when it stopped listening to those closest to the work, a response offered without accusation or flattery, and it struck him that she spoke as if she assumed her thoughts mattered only when invited, never forcing them forward. And as days passed Alaric began testing the palace more deliberately, requesting tasks at inconvenient hours, asking the same question of different people, noting the variations in tone and effort, and always Elena remained consistent, arriving whether summoned or not, prepared whether expected or overlooked. And one night, after a long council meeting held beyond his hearing, he returned to his chambers visibly weary, allowing his shoulders to sag, and Elena quietly adjusted the room, dimming lamps, drawing curtains, and setting a chair where he could sit without strain, saying nothing until he spoke. And when he finally admitted that pretending not to see was more exhausting than he had anticipated, She did not rush to reassure him or pry into his reasons. She simply said that rest was allowed even for kings, a statement so simple it nearly undid him, because no one else had spoken to him as if rest were permitted rather than earned. And alone after she left, Alaric considered that power often demanded constant display, yet trust asked for stillness, and he began to wonder whether revealing his sight would change Elena or whether her constancy would remain. And that question lingered heavier than any test he had devised, because if she stayed the same after the truth, then he would have found something far rarer than loyalty. He would have found sincerity unshaken by power. And as the palace slept, King Alaric Blackwood realized that the greatest risk was no longer being deceived by others, but being changed by what he had already seen without opening his eyes. The following days introduced a subtle shift that neither the palace nor Elena more could fully name. Yet King Alaric felt it with increasing clarity, because his awareness had sharpened beyond observation into intention, and he began to shape moments rather than merely record them, requesting Elena's presence for tasks that placed her in closer proximity to the heart of the palace, not as favoritism, but as necessity, assigning her to assist during longer hours when patience wore thin and true. Character emerged, and it did not go unnoticed by others. Whispers following her steps, assumptions forming that she was currying favor with a weakened king, and Elena absorbed it quietly, never correcting rumors, never defending herself, focusing instead on the work itself. And one afternoon during a formal reception where voices overlapped and expectations pressed heavily, Alaric deliberately asked Elena to guide him through the crowded hall, a request that drew sharp looks because it placed an Omega Maid in full view of nobility. Yet Elena did not hesitate, her hand steady on his arm, her directions calm and precise, allowing him to move with confidence while preserving the illusion of dependence. And he felt the tension ripple outward, a silent challenge to those who believed hierarchy should remain untouched. And later, when the hall emptied and the air finally cooled, a senior official remarked that the arrangement was becoming inappropriate, that boundaries were blurring, and Elena was summoned and questioned in a tone that implied fault without accusation. And Alaric listened carefully as she answered with respectful honesty, explaining that her actions were based solely on the king's safety and comfort, not ambition. And when asked whether she understood her place, she replied that her place was wherever her duties were needed, no more and no less. And the simplicity of that answer unsettled the room, because it left no opening for manipulation, and Alaric sensed that his test had reached a delicate edge, where continued silence might cost Elena more than he intended. And that night he lay awake considering the cost of observation, because while he could endure misjudgment, she should not have to, and yet revealing the truth too soon would collapse the careful clarity he had gained. And the next morning he chose a quieter test, asking Elena to accompany him to the upper gallery at dawn, a space rarely used, filled with echoes and memories. And as they walked, he asked her what she would do if she were suddenly given power she did not expect, a question posed lightly, but weighted with meaning. And Elena paused before answering that power frightened her because it revealed who people were, including herself, and that she would rather be trusted with responsibility than authority, words that struck him deeply, because they mirrored his own unspoken fears. And when they reached the gallery, he deliberately stepped out of rhythm, creating a moment where she could have pulled him back sharply or allowed him to falter. And instead she adjusted seamlessly, guiding him without comment, preserving his dignity as naturally as breathing. And Alaric felt the final confirmation settle within him, that Elena Moore was not kind because she hoped to be seen, she was kind because it was who she was. And as the palace stirred awake below them, he understood that the time for passive testing was ending, because integrity deserved protection, not prolonged examination. And the question was no longer whether Elena would change if she learned the truth, but whether he would change if he continued to hide it. And with that realization, King Alaric Blackwood began preparing not a revelation of sight, but a reckoning of conscience, knowing that when the truth emerged, it would not be spectacle that mattered, but the quiet consistency that had already reshaped his understanding of loyalty, leadership, and trust. The shift that followed was quiet but unmistakable, like a change in weather felt through pressure rather than sight. and King Alaric began placing Elena more in situations that revealed not her obedience but her judgment, asking her to prioritize tasks when resources were limited, to choose which requests reached him first, and to explain her reasoning aloud, and she did so carefully, weighing fairness over influence, never favoring those with louder voices, and it became evident that she understood the palace not as a ladder to climb, but as a system that required balance, and this unsettled those who relied on proximity to power rather than responsibility, because Elena did not bend to impatience or flattery, and one afternoon a minor dispute arose over the allocation of space for an upcoming event, voices tight with urgency, and Alaric allowed the disagreement to unfold within his hearing, intervening only to ask Elena what she would recommend, and the room stilled at the question, because it was not customary for an Omega Maid to be consulted, yet Elena answered without hesitation, suggesting a solution that accommodated safety, tradition, and efficiency, and when challenged, she explained calmly, grounding her reasoning in practicality rather than rank, and the solution was adopted not because of who she was, but because it worked, and afterward, resentment followed her down the corridors like a shadow, remarks sharpened, cooperation thinned, and Alaric heard it all, the muttered complaints that she was overstepping, the insinuations that she was manipulating a blind king, and each word carved a clearer outline of the truth he could no longer ignore, that by remaining silent, he was allowing integrity to be punished, and that evening he asked Elena to stay a moment longer, not as a command but a request, and when she did, he asked whether she was comfortable with the attention her work was drawing, and she paused, choosing honesty over reassurance, admitting that it was difficult but that she believed doing the work correctly mattered more than being liked. And when he asked why she stayed despite the strain, she answered simply that leaving would mean letting others define her limits, and that answer settled something final within him, because leadership without protection was observation without responsibility, and the next day he altered the test, requesting Elena accompany him during a review of household operations where her presence was likely to be challenged, and when objections arose, he did not silence them immediately, allowing their discomfort to surface fully. And then he asked Elena to speak, and she did, addressing concerns respectfully, reaffirming her role as service rather than influence, and something shifted as those listening realized that her authority came not from proximity to the king, but from consistency. And later, alone again, Alaric reflected on how easily power hid behind appearances, how blindness had given him sight into the palace's habits, yet it was Elena who revealed its values, and he recognized that the true test was nearing its end, because prolonging it would no longer serve truth but fear, and as dusk settled and the palace quieted, he resolved that the revelation to come would not be theatrical. It would be deliberate, measured, and just, because when he opened his eyes, it would not be to expose others, but to stand beside the one who had never needed to see him clearly to treat him with dignity. And in that decision, King Alaric Blackwood accepted that leadership demanded not only discernment, but courage, especially when protecting the quiet strength that had already changed the course of his rule. The tension that had been simmering beneath the palace routines finally surfaced in ways that could no longer be ignored, and King Alaric sensed it the moment voices began lowering when Elena Moore entered a room, not out of respect but calculation, because she had become a measure others were being judged against, and resentment had a way of seeking release, and it arrived disguised as concern when a small error was reported in the household accounts, a discrepancy minor in scale, yet amplified in tone, and without hesitation the blame drifted toward Elena, not because evidence pointed to her, but because she was visible, and Alaric allowed the accusation to reach his ears without interruption, listening to the careful phrasing, the pauses that suggested satisfaction rather than worry, and he understood that this was the moment his test demanded response, and so he asked Elena to join him privately, not to defend herself, but to explain the process she had followed, and she did so, calmly, outlining each step with clarity, acknowledging where oversight could have occurred without shifting responsibility. And when he asked whether she believed the accusation was fair, she answered that fairness was less important than resolution, and that she trusted the truth to surface if given time. And that answer revealed the depth of her character more than any defense could have, because she did not seek vindication, only balance. and Alaric decided to press further, requesting that Elena oversee the correction personally while allowing those who accused her to observe, a choice that unsettled them, because it removed the comfort of distance. And as the process unfolded, it became clear that the error originated elsewhere, a result of haste rather than malice, and silence followed the realization, heavy and uncomfortable, and Elena accepted the correction without comment, neither triumphant nor resentful, simply efficient, and afterward Alaric overheard a quiet apology, offered without sincerity, followed by a suggestion that perhaps she had been lucky, and in that moment he recognized the cruelty of complacency, the way systems protected themselves by isolating integrity. And that evening he tested the palace one final time, arranging a late request that required coordination and patience, knowing fatigue would strip away pretense. And predictably some delayed, some delegated carelessly. And only Elena arrived prepared, attentive, and steady, and when he asked her whether she ever wished she had remained unnoticed, she paused longer than usual before admitting that anonymity was easier, but that ease rarely changed anything worth changing, and those words settled like truth spoken without expectation of reward, and Alaric felt the weight of decision fully now, because his silence had become a shield for those who benefited from his supposed weakness, while exposing those who served with integrity, and that imbalance could not stand, and yet he chose restraint for one more day, not to gather more evidence, but to consider the manner of revelation, because spectacle would cheapen the lesson. And the next morning he asked Elena to accompany him to the council chamber, a place of authority where her presence would be questioned, and as expected, objections arose immediately, framed as concern for propriety, and Alaric listened until the words circled back on themselves. Then he asked a single question, whether competence was less appropriate than tradition, and the room fell quiet, and Elena remained still beside him, not seeking approval, not retreating. And in that stillness Alaric understood that the truth did not require announcement to be powerful, but revelation would require courage, and as the council dispersed, he felt the final preparation settle into resolve, because the next step would change everything, not by exposing his side alone, but by redefining what the palace understood as strength. And as he returned to his chambers with Elena at his side, King Alaric Blackwood accepted that when he opened his eyes, it would be not to test others further, but to stand openly beside the one who had never needed proof to offer him dignity. And that choice marked the end of his silence and the beginning of accountability. The night before the revelation arrived without ceremony, settling over the palace with an uneasy calm that felt heavier than conflict. And King Alaric sensed it in the slowed footsteps outside his chambers and the way conversations ended abruptly when he passed, because anticipation had replaced rumor. And Elena more felt it too, though she did not name it, only noticing how requests doubled and patience thinned, how she was assigned tasks that pulled her in opposite directions, testing not her skill but her endurance, and she completed them anyway, moving through corridors long after lamps were dimmed, correcting small oversights that others no longer bothered to fix. And when she finally reached the storage room near the eastern wing to return ledgers she had been asked to organize alone, the weight of the day caught up to her, because integrity asked for strength but never promised shelter, and she allowed herself a single moment of stillness, resting her hands on the cool wooden table, believing herself unseen. And in that quiet space her composure softened, not into despair but honesty, a whispered acknowledgement that she was tired, not of work, but of being measured by standards that shifted whenever she met them. And she wondered aloud whether quiet goodness was meant to endure without recognition, and King Alaric heard every word from the corridor beyond, having followed the sound of her footsteps out of concern rather than command, and he did not interrupt, because what she expressed was not complaint but reflection, a question posed to herself rather than accusation. And when she finished, straightened, and prepared to leave, she noticed him standing there and froze, apologizing immediately for speaking out of turn. And Alaric reassured her calmly, telling her that rest was not disloyalty and that reflection was not weakness, and she accepted his words respectfully but without relief, because her uncertainty was deeper than reassurance could reach, and that moment sealed his decision fully, because no test justified the quiet erosion of someone who served without agenda. And the following morning, he requested Elena accompany him to the grand hall earlier than usual, a request that spread quickly and drew attention. And as they walked, Elena sensed the shift, the way others watched more closely, the way silence followed them, and she wondered whether she had misjudged her place entirely, whether proximity had created misunderstanding rather than trust. And when they reached the center of the hall, Alaric paused, and for a heartbeat the palace held its breath, because something was about to change. And Elena prepared herself for instruction, correction, or dismissal, any of which she would accept with the same dignity she had shown since her arrival. And Alaric felt the weight of responsibility settle like armor rather than burden, because leadership was not proven by how long one could observe, but by when one chose to act. And before he spoke, he turned slightly toward Elena, not to position her as subject or symbol, but to ensure she stood beside him rather than behind. A quiet decision that shifted the room more than any declaration, and Elena felt it immediately. The subtle change in posture, the awareness that she was no longer alone in her integrity, and as murmurs rippled outward, Alaric understood that the final lesson would not be delivered through accusation or spectacle, but through clarity, because truth spoken calmly carried more weight than surprise ever could. And as he drew a steady breath, preparing to end the illusion he had maintained for weeks, King Alaric Blackwood recognized that what he was about to reveal was not merely his sight, but his standard, and that from this moment forward, the palace would be measured not by tradition or convenience, but by the quiet strength that had already proven itself without ever asking to be seen. The moment arrived without a raised voice or dramatic command, only a deliberate stillness that drew every eye in the grand hall toward King Alaric, and he stood quietly with Elena more beside him, feeling the familiar marble beneath his boots and the weight of expectation pressing in. And for the first time in weeks he did not reach for his cane, because the illusion had served its purpose, and he opened his eyes calmly, letting sight return to the room that had believed him unable to see. And the shift was immediate. Breaths caught, posture stiffened, and realization spread like a ripple across polished stone, because truth, once revealed, did not need announcement. And Elena sensed it before she understood it, the subtle change in the air, the way attention sharpened, and when she turned slightly, she saw his gaze focused and clear, steady not with triumph but resolve, and her first instinct was not shock but concern, wondering whether she had failed some unspoken boundary. And Alaric addressed the room evenly, explaining that his blindness had been a choice made to understand the palace without the filter of fear, that he had listened, observed, and learned more in silence than he ever had while seated on the throne. And he spoke not to accuse but to clarify, naming patterns rather than individuals, describing delays, dismissals, and the ease with which dignity had been set aside when it was assumed he could not notice. And the hall remained silent because no one could deny what had been witnessed. And then he turned toward Elena, acknowledging her presence not as symbol but example, stating plainly that while many had adjusted their behavior based on convenience, she had not altered her conduct. Once, offering care without expectation, competence without demand, and honesty without agenda, and Elena felt the weight of the room shift onto her. Uncomfortable not because of attention, but because she had never acted to be seen, and she lowered her gaze instinctively. But Alaric continued, clarifying that integrity was not rank, that service was not weakness, and that leadership required protecting those who upheld standards even when it was inconvenient. And he addressed the palace directly, stating that from this day forward accountability would be measured not by proximity to power, but by consistency of action, and no one was dismissed, no one was publicly corrected, because the lesson was not punishment but alignment. And then he did something unexpected. He stepped back slightly, positioning Elena not behind him but beside him, making visible the partnership of values rather than authority, and murmurs followed, not of protest, but recalibration, as those present understood that the structure they relied upon had shifted quietly but permanently. And afterward, as the hall gradually resumed motion, Elena finally spoke, asking softly whether she should return to her duties, uncertain of her place in this new clarity. And Alaric answered that her duties had never changed, only the recognition of their importance had. and he assured her that she was not responsible for the discomfort of others, nor obligated to diminish herself to preserve ease. And in that exchange, something settled between them, not intimacy but trust earned through consistency. And as they left the hall together, Elena processing the revelation with calm acceptance rather than awe, Alaric understood that the true success of his test was not exposing weakness but confirming strength, and that what he had revealed was not simply that he could see, but that he would no longer allow integrity to stand alone. And in that moment, the palace began to learn what leadership looked like when sight was paired with conscience. The days that followed unfolded with a steadiness that felt new to the palace, not quieter but clearer, as if every corridor had been swept of assumptions and left with intention, and King Alaric moved through his halls with open sight and measured steps, no longer observing from the margins, but engaging directly, correcting processes with calm explanations, acknowledging effort without spectacle. And Elena Moore returned to her duties with the same composure she had always carried, though now eyes followed her with a different weight, curiosity tempered by respect, and she neither sought nor rejected it, focusing instead on the work itself, because consistency had become her language. And one morning Alaric asked her to join him in reviewing daily operations, not as a summons but an invitation, clarifying that her insight had proven reliable, and Elena accepted without hesitation, contributing observations grounded in experience rather than theory, and the exchange felt natural, unforced, because trust had already been established through action. And as the palace adjusted to new expectations, small changes took root, requests became clearer, delays less frequent, and courtesy returned not because it was demanded, but because it was modeled, and Alaric noticed that leadership multiplied when integrity was recognized. And later, as sunlight filtered through high windows and the pace of the day slowed, Elena approached him privately with a request. She had weighed carefully, asking whether her continued proximity might cause distraction or misunderstanding. And Alaric listened fully before answering that clarity prevented misunderstanding far better than distance, and that her role would be defined by responsibility rather than rumor. And she accepted this with a nod, relief present but restrained, because she had never asked for elevation, only fairness. And in the weeks that followed, Alaric instituted a standard that echoed quietly through the palace, that dignity was not conditional, that service was not invisible, and that authority carried obligation to protect those who upheld the work when no one was watching. And Elena became a quiet reference point, not elevated above others but trusted among them. And she noticed how newer staff mirrored her habits, how patience spread without instruction. And one evening, as the palace settled into rest, Alaric and Elena stood briefly at the gallery overlooking the grounds, sharing a moment of silence that required no explanation. And Alaric acknowledged that the test he had devised had taught him more than he anticipated, not about deception but about courage. And he thanked her not with praise but with recognition, stating that she had reminded him what leadership felt like when stripped of performance. And Elena responded that she had simply done what she believed was right, and that belief felt steady rather than modest, because it was grounded. And as they parted, the future felt less uncertain than before, not because all questions were answered, but because values had been aligned, and the palace carried forward with a renewed sense of purpose, shaped not by a single revelation, but by sustained example. And King Alaric Blackwood understood that true sight was not the ability to see what others hid, but the willingness to stand openly with what was right. And Elena Moore continued her work with the same quiet strength that had begun it all, knowing now that integrity, once recognized, could change not only how one was treated, but how an entire place learned to see.